Hi there. So today, I'm coming to you from what used to be Robert E. Lee Circle in New Orleans. Today it's the circle that has no name. There's a streetcar coming by, so bear with me for a little second here till the noise goes away. You can see the statue's gone, but the column remains. And this is because the city council didn't put in the budget, or the mayor, the cost to remove the column. They took the statue off, which was $200,000, about $150,000 over budget, but they left the pedestal. And there's no plans for the 2018 budget as to how to fund removing this. Today, or yesterday, General Kelly, who's the chief of staff at the White House, said Robert E. Lee is an honorable man. And that has set off a firestorm I was watching at lunchtime. How could you say that Lee was an honorable man and, everything else, and it's crazy. So I'm kind of like a little historian here in New Orleans about him. This is the history of Lee Circle. It used to be, for about 70 years, it was called Palace de Tivoli Circle, but they were supposed to actually put a merry-go-round here. They never got it done. And the city was founded in New Orleans in 1718. Around 1808, it had expanded to where we are now, Lee Circle, and there was talk about what to do, and you could see in the noise you heard of a streetcar moving around. This was actually a place where the trains came and would go one way or another way. It was a place of connecting to go whether east or west or north or south. So somebody came up with the idea of putting a merry-go-round here as the neighborhood was starting to develop. And then when Robert Lee died, they had the idea that for the 1884 World's Fair in New Orleans, they rushed to get a statue up of Lee. And I've read this book here called The Life and Legend of Robert E. Lee. So why might John Kelly say he's an honorable man? Well, to begin with, he's got 35 years in the U.S. Army. And in his opinion, he really was against secession because his dad had fought with General Washington to create the Union. And he wrote for years in advance, we have spent 80 years building this country so that we can have prosperity and everything else going on. Why would we throw that away with secession? He really favored a gradual emancipation after the slaves were educated and given job training. He had a plan. He was actually, I think, one of the first people to ever have really a think tank. So when he goes to Washington University as president, and now Washington and Lee, his philosophies and his thought process on how to transition from 4 million people in slavery, if they had followed that when he started writing about that in 1856 at least, and maybe earlier, to his wife, because at that point he said slavery is a moral and political evil. I mean, what more stronger statement can you have as a man who opposes slavery? He also opposed secession, but when he resigned his commission, and on April 17th of 1861, because Lincoln had asked him to lead an army of 70,000 men to destroy Virginia, and he said, I cannot lift my sword against my family and my friends in my home state of Virginia. And he had said that for years in advance. He was stationed out in Texas in 1861 and had been there for many years. He had been visit his family, he had like 6 or 7 kids. He comes back to Texas, they succeeded, so did Louisiana. So he grabs a boat, and he's told when he gets back to Texas that now you're a prisoner of war. But since they liked him, they said, if you leave with the clothes on your back, we'll let you go home. So he gets a boat, he comes into New Orleans, so he's still a Union officer, a lieutenant colonel. If you think about that trivia, he is the first Union officer to land in New Orleans after Louisiana succeeded. We're talking about February 1861. He goes back to Virginia, they promote him to a full colonel in the U.S. Army, and then bring him into Washington, D.C., and say, we want you to lead 75,000 men to attack your home state. And he says, I can't do it. And he writes this very painful letter resigning from the U.S. Army. But before that, we go back to the Mexican-American War, where he came through New Orleans. I'm going to wait for this car. So in 1846, he comes through New Orleans, and he's headed out to the Mexican-American War. And he buys a horse here. He's stationed here for a short period, named Grace Darling, and he rides that off to the Mexican-American War. He establishes himself there for for his strategies on how to move troops. Phenomenal brilliance, but also the courage. He stayed up 72 hours during one battle straight to make sure that his plan worked. He was under General Scott at the time. He also was supposed to go with meet up with a group of men and officers and whatever party to go explore how to make a maneuver into Mexico. They didn't show up, so he went by himself because he says, we got to do it. That's what we're here for. And he is behind enemy lines, and a group of Mexican soldiers stumbles upon him. He hides, for hours, covered himself covered so he doesn't get discovered. And eventually comes up with this master plan that nobody would thought was possible, but he figured out how to get water through the troop movements, the civil engineer, which is what he was. You take it back a step. So he opens up with that battle. He gets wounded twice. 6 western states become United States. Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Utah, Nevada, all through that war. So we can actually give Lee some of the credit for that happening. Scott praised him as his brilliance during that war, contributing to success. You go back further, and by the time he was 35 years old, he had actually redesigned the flow of the Mississippi River to save St. Louis, which was becoming high and dry and landlocked. The Mississippi was moving away. The mayor of St. Louis, he was the 3rd engineer assigned to fix that, called him the man who tamed the Mississippi. So now in New Orleans, we're actually sending council members all kind of places to learn how to control the Mississippi, to do diversion projects. We should just read, as the engineers did of the civil engineers of the Corps, Lee's logs for those 4 years he was in St. Louis on his theories on how to control the Mississippi. Looking at that, once the war ended, he negotiated a lot. Ulysses Grant invited him back to the White House. He gave up his land to become his son did, mostly, to become Arlington National Cemetery. So when you look at that, Eisenhower, FDR, Churchill have all said he was an honorable man. Why would we now be upset that General Kelly had just followed the footsteps of those 3 leaders, plus Congress, which christened a submarine after him around 1960? So it's kind of bewildering to think that suddenly today, all we see is this man that decided he'd rather defend his home state than attack his own family. And that's why I think General Kelly is justified in saying Robert E. Lee is an honorable man. Now, you know the history. It's worth reading any book on it. His writings about slavery, how much he opposed its secession, how much he opposed it, but how much he refused to lift his sword to attack his own sons and his friends and his Virginia. Thanks. Save Nola Heritage. You can find more.